In this lecture, we're going to take a look at sensory receptors. And when we talk about a receptor, we're also referring to a sensory neuron. And this is a cell that transforms stimulus energy into electrical energy or bioelectrical energy. Now, the term receptor potential is a little bit more specific in that it refers to the nature of that bioelectrical signal, so the amplitude and duration of that signal. And this transmission of sensory information does so through what's called a train of action potentials. And this refers to a series of successive action potentials that are generated by just one neuron. And that's illustrated at the bottom of the slide here. So if we take a look at a single action potential, roughly depicted with this tracing here, a single action potential can be quantified by its period or wavelength. But what we're seeing here are 5 successive action potentials, and that generates what's called a train frequency. So as we can see that we have 5, these latter 2 are spaced closer together. So once the action potential has completed its entire course and the membrane has gone back to its resting state, we see we have a short period of time before the next one is generated, another period of time, and so on and so forth, until we see here where as soon as the membrane is restored back to its resting state, another action potential is generated. So what actually happens here along this train is that the frequency of the appearance of these action potentials actually increases towards the end. Now, the general pathway of the transmission of sensory information occurs through the initiation of the activation of those sensory receptors through compression, stretch, or vibration if the stimulus is mechanical in nature. And there are generally 6 different receptors in skin. And in muscle, there are generally 3 different receptors. And in muscle specifically, these receptors are sensitive to a change in muscle length, how fast that muscle length changes, as well as the force generated by that muscle. And so what we see here on the bottom of the slide is we have depicted here a single skeletal muscle, and inside that skeletal muscle are embedded sensory organs. And so the general term muscle afferent is a reference to the sensory connection between the muscle and the central nervous system. If we take a look at this depiction of the skin, we also have a skin afferent, and when these sensory organs are triggered by, in this example, mechanical stimuli, it will send a series of action potential trains towards the central nervous system. And the connection between those sensory neurons and other neurons are actually quite extensive, and we'll examine that later in other videos. So if we take a closer look at the sensory receptor, the cell body of the sensory receptor is housed in what's just generally referred to as the DRG, or the dorsal root ganglion. And the dorsal root ganglion is a cluster of cell body neuron of the cell bodies of sensory neurons outside the spinal cord. And these neurons are generally described as pseudo-unipolar or sometimes bipolar, because these sensory neurons are characterized by 2 axons. And so if we start on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, in this illustration of the skin, we see that sensory receptors embedded within the skin are triggered by a mechanical stimulus, and the mechanical stimulus will set up and cause a discharge of action potential trains that will travel along the axon towards the cell body housed just outside the spinal cord. Now, because the transmission of this information comes from the periphery towards the central nervous system, this is a relatively long distance. And these neurons, even though they're myelinated, if they're myelinated, are subject to a decay in the amplitude. And so once that action potential reaches the cell body just outside the spinal cord in the DRG, that is characterized by a relatively short delay, and then subsequently another discharge or another action potential is generated, and that action potential will travel along this axon a short distance into the gray matter of the spinal cord, where the sensory neuron will synapse with other neurons. And when we think about the somatosensory system, there are three general functions, particularly when it relates to the control of human movement. And the first here is that the somatosensory system serves in a proprioception manner. And the term proprioception is generally means one's own or a sense of oneself. And it's the perception of body position and movement. And a person's conscious awareness of that is generated by sensory signals coming originally from muscles, coming from tendons, skin, and joints. Two other functions here include what's called exteroception. And exteroception refers to a sense of direction and interaction with the external world. And this includes the sense of touch, contact, pressure, and identification through the identification of objects. And the ability to perform motor actions, such as pressing, grasping, or tapping, does depend upon the ability to sense the environment. Interoception refers to the sensory transmission of stimuli regarding the internal state of the body. So one example is an active muscle contraction, where sensory organs buried deep inside the muscle will inform the central nervous system of the state of that muscle. Other areas of the body that relies on interoception includes the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, and the digestive system. And most of these are actually not consciously perceived, and these latter functions serve to maintain internal homeostasis, physiological homeostasis. Now, when we talk about somatic sensation, this refers to the process of detecting changes in as well as outside the body, particularly when it relates to objects against the skin. With respect to signals generated inside the body, this will also inform the central nervous system of the position of joints, as well as transmitting very important information regarding tissue damage in the form of pain. And in order to transmit this information, there are specialized nerves and nerve endings that detect that stimuli. And these reside within muscles, tendons, ligaments, skin, and organs. In terms of the mechanical stimulus that originates from outside the body, skin stretch through physical contact is the major mechanism for exteroception when it comes to touch. Note that chemical signals will also trigger a somatic sensation, and one example of those chemical signals includes the ingestion of food. So sensory receptors, once again, refer to specialized nerve endings that detect stimuli. And these receptors transmit action potentials via sensory axons and are just simply referred to as afferent. Most of these sensory receptors are mechanical in nature, which means that these are nerve endings, sensory neurons that are sensitive to physical deformation. And remember that the information transmission occurs through action potentials through the opening of ion channels. In terms of classifying sensory receptors, this chart summarizes that information coming primarily from skin as well as muscles. But depending upon the original tissue, whether it's skin or muscles, there is a unique classification system for these sensory receptors. When it comes to skin, we see that we use a combination of uppercase English letters and lower and Greek letters. So we have A alpha, A beta, A delta, and C fibers, sensory fibers originating from skin. From muscles, we have what are called group 1, group 2, group 3, and group 4 using Roman numerals to describe the different unique characteristic of these sensory receptors. And these pictures here, these drawings represent the general physical characteristics of these sensory receptors. So what we see here is that A alpha or group 1, depending if we're talking about skin or muscles, these sensory neurons have very similar physical characteristics. And as we move from A alpha to beta to delta to C, group 1, 2, 3, and 4, we see the general pattern where the axon of that sensory neuron depicted here in this orange has a smaller and smaller caliber or diameter size. And we see that the A alphas in the group 1 are extensively myelinated and are of the largest diameter. A betas or type 2, A deltas or type 3, we see that these ones progressively decrease in caliber or diameter of the actual axon, and the myelination gets thinner and thinner until we get to C or type 4 sensory receptors, which are bare axons which are not myelinated. And the general classification of these neurons have a range of diameters from up to as much as 20 microns in diameter to as small as 0.2 microns in diameter. And because of the combination of diameter and myelination, the type A alphas in skin and group 1s in muscles have the fastest transmission of action potentials, where we see values ranging from 80 to 120 meters per second to as slow as 0.5 to 2 meters per second for the so-called C or type 4 fibers. And these neurons are typically characteristic of proprioceptors of skeletal muscle. The vast majority of the axons in skin are actually A beta, but we do have A alphas in skin as well. And we see that there's a progressively slowing of the speed of action potential transmission, where the transmission of pain, temperature, as well as itch transmits the slowest in comparison to the largest diameter sensory receptors. And so on this slide, we're going to take a look at the different types of receptors based upon stimulus type. So mechanoreceptors are receptors that are sensitive to mechanical stimuli, and these are receptors that detect physical distortion of tissues, so bending or stretching of tissues. So some examples include knee movement. These can come internally as well. So bladder distension will stretch and compress. Sensory receptors buried in the wall of the smooth muscle of the bladder or pinching skin will discharge those sensory receptors. Nociceptors are specifically designed to discharge with potentially damaging stimuli to tissues. And nociceptors are the neural receptors, the sensory receptors that are involved in pain transmission. Thermoreceptors are sensitive to temperature changes. Chemoreceptors are neurons that will form chemical bonds with certain chemicals, and that will discharge action potentials back to the central nervous system. And as mentioned earlier, proprioceptors are sensitive to body position and movement, and proprioceptors are actually a type of mechanoreceptor as well. And the four stimuli or categories for the four stimuli that will cause a discharge of these receptors are based upon modality. So when we talk about the modality, that is the mode of the stimulus. So whether it's mechanical, thermal, chemical, so on and so forth. The location is also an important consideration in terms of understanding the sensory signals that are generated. The intensity of the stimuli also will dictate how those neurons will discharge, as well as timing is an important consideration when thinking about how these neurons will send information back to the central nervous system. So this ends this video on sensory receptors.